डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन युनिव्हर्सिटी.
Namaskar and greetings of the day to all the students watching this video. I, Twinkle Chandarana, Assistant Professor English, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University, welcome all of you in today's lecture. Well friends, today we are going to discuss an interesting poem titled as Ode to the West Wind, written by P.B. Shelley. Let us begin with the discussion on this poem by its brief summary and analysis. The components of this presentation are brief summary of the poem, the form of the poem, the commentary given by the critics, the themes of the poem, the motives, the literary devices, and at last, check your progress in references and web resources. So let us begin by discussing the brief summary. Ode to the West Wind summary is a brief version of the poem written by the renowned English romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1819. The poet wrote this poem in the woods outside Florence, that is in Italy, during the month of autumn. The poem begins with the poet appealing to the wild west wind of autumn. He notices how the wind is scattering the dead leaves and spreading the seeds. This will result in their nurturing in the season of spring. The speaker treats the west wind as a force of death and decay, and welcomes this death and decay because it means that rejuvenation and rebirth will come soon. In the final two sections of the poem, the speaker suggests that he wants to help to promote this rebirth through his own poetry, and that rejuvenation he hopes to see is both political and poetic, a rebirth of society and its way of writing. Ode to the West Wind is a poem that shows us the power of the wind which brings a change in the natural world. Similarly, the poet wishes for reform in the society. Moreover, the poem has underlying themes of optimism and hope for a better future. The speaker invokes the wild west wind of autumn, which scatters the dead leaves and spreads the seeds so that they may be nurtured by the spring, and asks that the wind, a destroyer and preserver, might hear him. The speaker calls the wind as the dirge of the dying year and describes how it stirs up in violent storms and again implores it to hear him. The speaker says that the wind stirs the Mediterranean from his summer dreams and cleaves the Atlantic into choppy chasms, making the sapless foliage of the ocean tremble, and asks for a third time that it hears him. The speaker says that if he were a dead leaf that the wind could bear, or a cloud it could carry, or a wave it would push, or even if he were as a boy the comrade of the winds wandering over heaven, then he would never have needed to pray to the wind and invoke its powers. He pleads with the wind to lift him as a wave, as a leaf, a cloud. For though he is like the wind at heart, untamable and proud, he is now chained and bowed with the weight of his hours upon the earth. The speaker asks the wind to make me thy lyre, to be his own spirit, and to drive his thoughts across the universe, like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. He asks the wind, by the incantation of this verse, to scatter his words among the mankind, to be the trumpet of a prophecy. speaking both in regard to the season and in regard to the effect upon mankind that he hopes his words to have. The speaker asks, "If winter comes, can spring be left behind?" Shelley appended a note to the Ode to the West Wind when it appeared in the Prometheus Unbound volume in the year 1820. He quotes, "This poem was conceived and chiefly written in a wood that skirts the Arno, near Florence, and on a day when that tempestuous wind, whose temperature is at once mild and animating, was collecting the vapors which pour down the autumnal rains. They began, as I foresaw, at sunset with a violent tempest of hail and rain, attended by that magnificent thunder and lightning peculiar to the Cisalpine regions." The note is interesting in that it shows that the poem came out of a specific experience. The imagery of the poem suggests a natural phenomenon that is observed while it is taking place. The fact that it was written near Florence, that is Dante's city, may explain why Shelley used terza rima, the stanza of Dante's Divine Comedy, but rare in English poetry and rarest in the Ode. Terza rima is a series of triplets with interlocking rhymes, that is ABA, BCB, CDC, etc. Shelley modified the pattern by ending each of the 5 sections of the poem with a climactic couplet. In keeping with this terza rima, he concentrates on the effects of the west wind on 3 classes of objects, that is, leaves, clouds, and water. The combination of terza rima and the threefold effect of the west wind gives the poem a pleasing structural symmetry. In the ode, Shelley, as in To a Skylark and as in The Cloud, uses the poetic technique of myth, with which he had been working on a large scale in his work Prometheus Unbound in the year 1818. The west wind is a spirit, as is the skylark. It possesses great powers, and for this very reason, Shelley can pray to it for what he feels he is deeply in need of. He falls upon the thorns of life, he bleeds. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed him. It was Shelley's belief that poetry, by appealing to the imagination, could stir the reader to action in a given direction. With Shelley, this direction was liberty and democracy. In his work Prometheus Unbound, he sketched the wonderful world of freedom that he dreamed of readers fascinated by Shelley's glowing descriptions. They would be stimulated to want such a world too. Unfortunately, readers seemed uninterested in his poetry, and democracy was not making progress in the Europe of 1819 when he wrote the poem. Shelley was profoundly discouraged, chained and bowed by a heavy weight of hours if he had the power possessed by his west wind's mythical divinity. Readers would listen and freedom would prosper. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Scatter my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. By using the poetic device of myth, Shelley is able to indulge in wish thinking without seeming to, and at the same time he can strengthen the virtue of hope in himself. The poem ends optimistically. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Freedom will grow no matter what obstacles there may be, and Shelley's words will help it to grow. Friends, let us now discuss the form of this poem. Each of the 7 parts of the poem, Ode to the West Wind, contains 5 stanzas, 4 3-line stanzas and 2-line couplet, all metered in iambic pentameter. The rhyme scheme in each part follows a pattern known as terza rima, the 3-line rhyme scheme employed by Dante in his work Divine Comedy. In the 3-line terza rima stanza, the first and third lines rhyme and the middle line does not. Then the end sound of that middle line is employed as the rhyme for the first and third lines in the next stanza. The final couplet rhymes with the middle line of the last 3-line stanza. Thus, each of the 7 parts of Ode to the West Wind follows this scheme: ABA, DCB, CDC, DED, EE. This was about the form of the poem, but what are the commentary given by the critics on the poem? Let us have a look at the same. The wispy, fluid terza rima of Ode to the West Wind finds Shelley taking a long thematic leap beyond the scope of hymn to intellectual beauty and incorporating his own art into his meditation on beauty and the natural world. Shelley invokes the wind magically, describing its power and its role on as both destroyer and preserver, and asks the wind to sweep him out of his torpor as a wave, as a leaf, and as a cloud. In the 5th section, the poet then takes a remarkable turn, transforming the wind into a metaphor for his own art, the expressive capacity that drives dead thoughts like withered leaves over the universe, to quicken a new birth, that is, to quicken the coming of the spring. Here, the spring season is a metaphor for a spring of human consciousness, imagination, liberty, or morality, all the things Shelley hoped his art could help him to bring about in the human mind. Shelley asked the wind to be his spirit, and in the same moment he makes it his metaphorical spirit, his poetic faculty, which will play him like a musical instrument, the way the wind strums the leaves of the trees. The thematic implication is significant. Whereas the older generation of romantic poets viewed nature as a source of truth and authentic experience, the younger generation largely viewed nature as a source of beauty and aesthetic experience. In this poem, Shelley explicitly links nature with art by finding powerful natural metaphors with which to express his ideas about the power, import, quality, and ultimate effect of aesthetic expression. So friends, let us now discuss the themes of the poem. The first theme is the heroic visionary role of the poet. In Shelley's poetry, the figure of the poet, and to some extent the figure of Shelley himself, is not simply a talented entertainer or even a perceptive moralist, but a grand, tragic, prophetic hero. The poet has a deep, mystic appreciation for nature, as in the poem to Wordsworth, written in the year 1816, and this intense connection with the natural world gives him access to profound cosmic truths, as in Alistair or the Spirit of Solitude. He has the power and the duty to translate these truths through the use of his imagination into poetry, but only a kind of poetry that the public can understand. Thus, his poetry becomes a kind of prophecy, and through his words, a poet has the ability to change the world for the better and to bring about political, social, and spiritual change. Shelley's poetry is a near divine savior comparable to Prometheus, who stole divine fire and gave it to humans in Greek mythology, and to Christ. Like Prometheus and Christ, figures of the poets in Shelley's work are often doomed to suffer because their visionary power isolates them from other men, because they are misunderstood by critics, and because they are persecuted by a tyrannical government, or maybe because they are suffocated by conventional religion and middle class values. In the end, however, the poet triumphs because his art is immortal, outlasting the tyranny of government, religion, and society, and living on to inspire new generations. The second theme in the poem is the power of nature. Like many of the Romantic poets, especially William Wordsworth, Shelley demonstrates a great reverence for the beauty of nature, and he feels closely connected to nature's power. In his early poetry, Shelley shares the romantic interest in pantheism, the belief that God or a divine unifying spirit runs through everything in the universe. He refers to this unifying natural force in many poems, describing it as the spirit of beauty. In Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, and identifying it with Mont Blanc and Arve River in Mont Blanc. This force is the cause of all human joy, faith, goodness, and pleasure, and it is also the source of poetic inspiration and divine truth. Shelley asserts several times that this force can influence people to change the world for the better. However, Shelley simultaneously recognizes that nature's power is not wholly positive. Nature destroys as often as it inspires or creates, and it destroys cruelly and indiscriminately. For this very reason, Shelley's delight in nature is mitigated by an awareness of its dark side. The third theme to be discussed is the power of the human mind. Shelley uses nature as his primary source of poetic inspiration. In such poems as The Mask of Anarchy, written on the occasion of the massacre at Manchester, that was in the year of 1819, and Ode to the West Wind, Shelley suggests that the natural world holds a sublime power over his imagination. This power seems to come from a stranger, more mystical place than simply his appreciation for nature's beauty or grandeur. At the same time, although nature has creative power over Shelley because it provides inspiration, he feels that his imagination has creative power over nature. It is the imagination or our ability to form sensory perceptions that allows us to describe nature in different original ways, which help to shape how nature appears and therefore how it exists. Thus, the power of the human mind becomes equal to the power of nature, and the experience of beauty in the natural world becomes a kind of collaboration between the perceiver and the perceived. Because Shelley cannot be sure that the sublime powers he senses in nature are only the result of his gifted imagination, he finds it difficult to attribute nature's power to God. The human role in shaping nature damages Shelley's ability to believe that nature's beauty comes solely from a divine source. Friends, after discussing the summary and themes, let us now discuss the motifs of this poem. The first motif is the season autumn. Shelley sets many of his poems in autumn, including Hymn to Intellectual Beauty and our very own work, Ode to the West Wind. Fall is a time of beauty and death, and so it shows both the creative and destructive powers of nature, a favorite Shelley theme. As a time of change, autumn is a fitting backdrop for Shelley's vision of political and social revolution. In Ode to the West Wind, autumn's brilliant colors and violent winds emphasize the passionate, intense nature of this poet, while the decay and death inherent in the season suggests the sacrifice and martyrdom of Christ-like poet. The second motif is of ghosts and spirits. Shelley's interest in the supernatural repeatedly appears in his work. The ghosts and spirits in his poems suggest the possibility of glimpsing a world beyond the one in which he lives. In Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, the speaker searches for ghosts and explains that ghosts are one of the ways men have tried to interpret the world beyond. The speaker of Mont Blanc encounters ghosts and shadows of real natural objects in the cave of poesy. Ghosts are inadequate in both poems. The speaker finds no ghosts in Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, and the ghosts of poesy in Mont Blanc are not the real thing, a discovery that emphasizes the elusiveness and mystery of supernatural forces. The third motive is of Christ. From his days at Oxford, Shelley felt deeply doubtful about organized religion, particularly Christianity. Yet, in his poetry, he often represents the poet as a Christ-like figure and thus sets the poet up as a secular replacement for Christ. Martyred by the society and conventional values, the Christ figure is resurrected by the power of nature and his own imagination and spreads his prophetic visions over the earth. Shelley further separates his Christ figures from traditional Christian values in Adonis, in which he compares the same character to Christ, as well as Cain, whom the Bible portrays as the world's first murderer. For Shelley, Christ and Cain are both outcasts and rebels, like romantic poets and like himself. Towards the end of lecture, let us now discuss the literary devices used by the poet in his poem. Shelley makes use of several literary devices in Ode to the West Wind. This includes alliteration, personification, and apostrophe. The latter is an interesting device that is used when the poet's speaker talks to something or someone that either can't hear them or cannot respond. In this case, the speaker starts out the poem by talking to the west wind as though it can do both. In addition to this, the poet also personifies the wind or gives it human abilities that forces or animals don't naturally have. Alliteration is a common type of repetition that appears when the poet repeats the same consonant or sound at the beginning of words. For example, lie and low in line 1 of stanza 3 of Canto 1, as well as sleep sky in stanza 1 of Canto 2. Enjambment is another common technique. It occurs several times in this poem, Ode to the West Wind. For example, the transition between lines 2 and 3 of stanza 1, Canto 1, as well as lines 2 and 3 of stanza 3, Canto 1. Let us now discuss the questions. The first question is, why is the poem Ode to the West Wind popular among the readers? Explain in detail, giving appropriate reasons. And the second question is, what are the themes and motives reflected in this poem? Elaborate. The web resources used while making this lecture or which can help you for further reading are Shump, Great Saver, Literariness and InterestingLiterature.com. Namaskar and greetings of the day to all the students watching this video.
स्वाध्यायः